Michael Sullivan stared at his reflection in the mahogany-framed mirror of his corner office, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. At 52, he'd built everything he'd dreamed of, a successful investment firm, a sprawling estate in Connecticut, and a family that was the envy of his social circle. Yet beneath the polished surface, hairline cracks were spreading like spider webs across the facade of his perfect life. His phone buzzed again, another message from Claire, his wife of 25 years. He ignored it, just as he'd been ignoring the growing distance between them. The real estate convention in Boston had been the perfect excuse to escape the suffocating tension at home. 3 days of mindless networking and corporate small talk seemed preferable to facing the truth he'd been avoiding. "Mr. Sullivan?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your son James is here to see you." Michael's stomach tightened. James rarely visited the office, especially unannounced. "Send him in, Sarah." The door opened, and James entered, tall, lean, wearing the same expensive suits Michael had taught him to appreciate. But today, something was different. The usual confidence was gone from his son's stance, replaced by a rigid tension that set off warning bells in Michael's mind. "Dad, we need to talk." James's voice carried an edge Michael had never heard before. "It's about Mom." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Michael gestured to the leather chairs facing his desk, maintaining his composure even as his heart rate accelerated. "What about her?" James remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. "I know about the transfers. The money you've been moving through the shell companies in the Caymans. Mom's trust fund, what's left of it." The carefully constructed walls of Michael's world trembled. He'd been so careful, so meticulous in covering his tracks. "Son, there are aspects of business and marriage that are complicated. Don't." James's voice cracked. "Don't try to explain this away. I've seen the documents. All of them. Including the ones about Jennifer." The name hit Michael like a physical blow. Jennifer Hayes, his partner in more ways than one over the past 2 years. The woman who'd helped him orchestrate the gradual dismantling of Claire's inheritance, all while sharing his bed in luxurious hotels across 3 continents. "How long have you known?" Michael asked, his throat dry. "Long enough to gather evidence. Long enough to understand exactly what you and Jennifer have been doing." James pulled a USB drive from his pocket, placing it on the desk between them. "Mom doesn't know yet about any of it. But she will, unless." "Unless what?" Michael's voice had grown dangerously quiet. "Unless you make this right. All of it. Starting with a full confession and restoration of Mom's assets." James finally sat down, his young face aged by disappointment. "You taught me about legacy, Dad. About integrity. Was it all just words?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan continued its endless dance of light and shadow, oblivious to the drama unfolding within. Michael's empire, built on carefully managed appearances and strategic relationships, was balanced on a knife's edge. "Does your sister know?" he finally asked. "Emily?" James laughed bitterly. "She's the one who found the first discrepancies. She's always been better with numbers than me, remember? She's the one who suggested I confront you first, give you a chance to fix this before it destroys everything." Michael stood, walking to the window. 25 floors below, people scurried like ants, each caught in their own web of choices and consequences. He'd always prided himself on being in control, on seeing all the angles. Now, cornered by his own children, he felt that control slipping away like sand through his fingers. His phone buzzed again, Claire, for the 4th time today. This time, he looked at the message, "Need to talk about the Foundation's annual gala. Something feels off with the numbers." The irony wasn't lost on him. Claire's charitable foundation, her passion project for the past decade, had been another casualty of his careful manipulations. The thought of her discovering the truth, of seeing the betrayal in her eyes, made his chest tighten. "How much time do I have?" he asked, not turning from the window. 24 hours, James replied. "Emily's prepared to take everything to the board tomorrow morning. And to Mom." As James's footsteps faded down the hallway, Michael remained at the window, watching the sun sink behind the city skyline. In the gathering darkness, his reflection grew clearer in the glass, a man at a crossroads, facing the consequences of years of calculated deception. The USB drive on his desk held either his salvation or his destruction. And somewhere in the city, Jennifer Hayes was probably waiting for his call, unaware that their carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. Michael reached for his phone, his finger hovering over Claire's number. In 24 hours, his life would change forever. The only question was whether he would be the architect of that change, or its victim. Claire Sullivan sat in her home office, surrounded by foundation documents that refused to add up. 25 years of marriage had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, every fiber of her being screamed that something was terribly wrong. The numbers before her told a story of systematic drainage, like water slowly seeping through invisible cracks. Her fingers traced the edge of an old photograph on her desk, she and Michael on their 20th anniversary, both smiling, his arm protective around her shoulders. 5 years ago. Before the subtle changes began. Before the late nights at the office turned into unexpected business trips. Before the distance in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. The door creaked open, and Emily slipped in, her daughter's presence both a comfort and a source of anxiety. At 23, Emily had inherited her mother's sharp mind for numbers and her father's determination. Lately, though, she'd been carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for her young shoulders. "Mom." Emily's voice was gentle. "Can we talk?" Claire noticed her daughter's hands trembling slightly as she sat down. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I need to show you something, but..." Emily's voice caught. "I need you to promise me you'll stay strong. For both of us." The papers Emily placed on the desk told a story Claire had feared but refused to acknowledge. Bank statements, transfer records, emails, each document another nail in the coffin of her marriage. As she read, Claire's world shifted on its axis, decades of trust crumbling like sand castles against the tide. Jennifer Hayes, Claire whispered, the name bitter on her tongue. Michael's partner in the Denver expansion. The woman who'd been at every corporate event for the past 2 years, whose perfectly manicured hands had lingered too long on Michael's arm at last year's Christmas party. "There's more," Emily said, her voice breaking. "The foundation funds. Dad's been using them to cover his tracks," Claire finished, the pieces finally falling into place. The children's hospital wing that was perpetually delayed, the scholarship program that never quite materialized. Her life's work, turned into a shell game for her husband's betrayal. The phone on her desk buzzed, Michael's face appearing on the screen. Claire stared at it, remembering all the times she'd reached for him in the night, only to find his side of the bed cold and empty. She let it ring. James went to confront him, Emily explained, watching her mother's face carefully. We thought he deserved one chance to make this right." Claire stood, walking to the window that overlooked their carefully manicured garden. The rose bushes she'd planted when they first moved in were in full bloom, their beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness of the truth she now held in her hands. "How long have you known?" she asked, not turning around. 3 months. James and I, we needed to be sure. We needed proof that would stand up in court, if... Emily's voice trailed off. Claire's hand pressed against the cool glass. "And the foundation? How much is left?" "Less than half of what should be there." "But Mom, that's not the worst part." Emily moved to stand beside her mother. "The Kingston development deal? The one Dad's been pushing you to approve? It's a trap. Once you sign those papers, everything goes to offshore accounts. You'd lose control completely. The Kingston deal, scheduled for signing tomorrow morning. Michael had been insistent, almost desperate for her to approve it. Now she understood why. A knock at the door made both women turn. James stood there, his face ashen. He knows we know. All of it. How did he take it? Emily asked. Like a cornered animal, James replied, moving to stand with his mother and sister. I gave him 24 hours to come clean, to make it right. Claire's laugh was hollow. 24 hours to hide the evidence, you mean? To move whatever's left beyond our reach. No, James said firmly. I have copies of everything. And Jennifer Hayes? She's already agreed to talk. Turns out Dad's been playing her too. She found out about the other women last week. Other women. The words hit Claire like physical blows. How many betrayals could be hidden in a single marriage? Her phone buzzed again, not Michael this time, but Robert Chen, her old law school friend. Now a partner at one of New York's most prestigious firms. The same firm that had handled her father's estate, including the trust fund that Michael had systematically plundered. Mom. Emily's voice was worried. What are you thinking? Claire straightened her shoulders, years of buried strength rising to the surface. I'm thinking it's time to show your father exactly who he married. James, call Jennifer Hayes. I want to meet her tonight. Emily, get me everything you have on the Kingston deal. And then. She picked up her phone, Robert Chen's number glowing on the screen. Then we're going to make sure the Sullivan name still stands for something when this is over. As she dialed Robert's number, Claire caught her reflection in the window, not the society wife or the charitable foundation head, but someone stronger, someone who had been waiting in the shadows of her own life for this moment of awakening. Behind her, her children exchanged glances, witnessing the transformation of the woman who had taught them about integrity, now preparing to fight for everything they believed in. The sun was setting over their perfectly manicured world, and in the gathering darkness, the real battle was about to begin. Jennifer Hayes sat across from Claire in the dimly lit corner of the St. Regis bar, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling as she reached for her untouched martini. The woman who had shared Michael's bed now faced his wife, their eyes meeting across a chasm of shared betrayal. I never knew about the foundation, Jennifer said softly, her composure cracking. He told me the offshore accounts were for tax purposes, legitimate business dealings. When I found the pictures of the others. She pulled out her phone, sliding it across the table. Claire didn't look at it. She didn't need to see evidence of other betrayals, other hotel rooms, other women caught in Michael's web of deception. Tell me about the Kingston deal. As Jennifer spoke, Claire felt an odd sense of calm settling over her. Each revelation was another piece of armor, strengthening her resolve. The woman before her wasn't an enemy, but another victim of Michael's calculated manipulation. He's planning to leave the country, Jennifer revealed, her voice barely above a whisper. After the Kingston signing. Everything's arranged, private jet, accounts in Singapore, a new identity. He never intended to stay, not with any of us. Back at the Sullivan estate, James paced the library, phone pressed to his ear. Are you sure about this, Uncle Robert? He listened intently to his mother's old law school friend, now their strongest ally. Yes, I understand the risks. But Mom needs to know everything before tomorrow. Emily sat at their father's desk, methodically going through decades of financial records. Each document told a story of systematic betrayal, of trust corrupted by greed. Her hands froze over a particular folder, its contents making her blood run cold. James, she called out, her voice urgent. Look at this. The original trust agreement from grandfather's will. The one Dad claimed was modified to give him full control. It wasn't just about Mom's inheritance. There's a second trust, for us. And Dad's been draining that too. The siblings stared at each other, the weight of this new betrayal settling between them. Their future, their security, everything their grandfather had worked to protect, systematically stripped away by their own father. Claire returned home to find her children waiting in the kitchen, their faces grave. The manila envelope Jennifer had given her felt heavy in her hands. "There's something you both need to know," she began, but Emily interrupted. "We found it, Mom. The second trust. Dad's been stealing from all of us." Claire sank into a chair, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "That's why he pushed so hard for you both to sign those investment documents last year. He needed your signatures to access the principal." "Mom," James said gently, "there's more. Uncle Robert found something in the offshore accounts. Regular payments to someone named Marcus Reynolds. Does that name mean anything to you?" Claire's face went pale. Marcus Reynolds, a name she hadn't heard in 25 years, since before her marriage to Michael. A name that carried secrets she'd buried deep in her past. "Mom." Emily moved closer, concerned by her mother's reaction. "Who is he?" "Someone who knows the truth about your father," Claire whispered. "About who he was before he became Michael Sullivan. About why he really married me." The kitchen fell silent, the tick of the antique clock on the wall marking the seconds until tomorrow's confrontation. Outside, thunder rolled across the Connecticut sky, a storm gathering strength just as they were. "Whatever happened in the past," James said firmly, "we face it together. As a family." Claire looked at her children, James, so like his father in appearance but with a moral strength that Michael had never possessed, Emily, with her quiet determination and fierce intelligence. They were her true legacy, not the money or the status or the carefully cultivated image Michael had built. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert, "Documents ready. Team in place for tomorrow. Are you sure about this?" Before she could respond, another message appeared, from Michael, "Coming home early. We need to talk. About everything." Claire's hand didn't shake as she typed her response, "Yes, we do. For the first time in our marriage, we're going to talk about the truth." The storm outside grew stronger, wind whipping through the garden Michael had never bothered to learn the names of the flowers in. Tomorrow would bring either destruction or liberation. But tonight, in this kitchen with her children, Claire finally understood that she had already won the most important battle, the one for her soul. Emily reached for her mother's hand, while James stood protectively behind them both. They were no longer victims of Michael's manipulation. They were survivors, preparing for the fight of their lives. And as the thunder crashed overhead, Claire felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the fierce joy of standing in her own truth, surrounded by the only people who truly mattered. Claire stood in her bedroom, watching headlights sweep across the driveway as Michael's car approached. Rain drummed against the windows, each drop echoing the rapid beating of her heart. 25 years of memories surrounded her, photos on the walls, shared belongings, the life they'd built together. Or rather, the life she'd thought they'd built. Marcus Reynolds' file lay open on the bed, its contents illuminating the darker corners of her marriage. Robert had delivered it personally an hour ago, his face grave as he handed it over. "Claire," he'd said, "there's something you need to understand about the man you married." The photographs inside showed a younger Michael, except he wasn't Michael then. David Anderson, investment advisor to elderly clients in Arizona, disappeared after millions went missing from their accounts. Thomas Wright, who orchestrated a similar scheme in Florida. Different names, different cities, but always the same pattern: gain trust, build relationships, then vanish with everything. "Mom." Emily's soft voice drew Claire from her thoughts. "Dad's here." Claire touched the silver locket at her throat, her mother's final gift before passing. Inside was a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, their love pure and untainted by deception. "I need a moment with him alone," she said quietly. "Whatever happens, whatever you hear, stay with your brother." "But Mom." "Promise me, Emily." Claire turned to her daughter, seeing the worry etched on her young face. "Some battles need to be fought alone." The front door opened downstairs, followed by the familiar sound of Michael's keys hitting the silver bowl in the foyer. Claire remembered picking out that bowl together during their honeymoon in Venice. Had he been calculating even then, planning his long game? Claire. Michael's voice carried up the stairs, uncertain in a way she'd never heard before. We need to talk. She descended the stairs slowly, each step measured and deliberate. Michael stood in the center of their living room, still in his business suit but somehow diminished, less substantial than the man who dominated their lives for so long. Yes, Claire agreed, her voice steady. Let's talk about Marcus Reynolds. The name hit Michael like a physical blow. She watched the color drain from his face, his carefully maintained facade cracking. How did you find out? Claire gestured to the papers she held. The same way I found out about Jennifer. And Sarah in Portland. And Elizabeth in Chicago. She paused, watching him process each revelation. The same way I discovered what happened to the Andersons' retirement fund in Phoenix. Or should I call you David? Michael, or David, or Thomas, or whatever his real name was, sank into an armchair, his universe contracting around him. You don't understand, he began, but Claire cut him off. I understand perfectly. I understand that 25 years ago, you chose me because my father's death made me vulnerable. Because a grieving woman with a substantial inheritance was the perfect mark. Her voice remained calm, even as decades of manipulation crystallized into sharp clarity. What I don't understand is our children. How could you steal from them? I never meant, he stopped, running a hand through his silver hair. It wasn't supposed to be like this. You were different. What we had, it became real. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face in harsh relief. For a moment, Claire saw him clearly, not the successful businessman, not the charming husband, but a man who had spent his life running from his own emptiness. Marcus Reynolds reached out to me 6 months ago, Claire revealed, watching his reaction carefully. He knew everything, had been tracking you for years. He offered to sell his silence. Michael's head snapped up. You've known for 6 months. I paid him, Claire continued, her voice thick with remembered pain. I paid him to protect our children from the truth about their father. And then I started looking, really looking, at our life together. The inconsistencies. The convenient explanations. The way you always had an answer, always knew exactly what to say to make me doubt myself. She moved to the window, watching the storm rage outside. I thought I was keeping our family safe, but I was just continuing the pattern. Teaching our children that lies are acceptable if they're wrapped in enough love. Claire, please, Michael stood, taking a step toward her. We can fix this. Together. I'll return everything, the foundation money, the trusts. We can start over. Like you started over in Arizona? In Florida? Claire turned to face him, her voice gaining strength. How many times have you had this conversation, Michael? How many women have you promised to make things right with? The silence between them was filled with the weight of unspoken truths. Upstairs, Claire knew her children were listening, learning their final lesson about the man they'd called father. I did love you, Michael whispered, and for once, Claire believed he was telling the truth. You and the children, you were supposed to be my redemption. We were never meant to be your redemption, Claire replied softly. We were meant to be your family. The doorbell rang, its chime cutting through the tension like a knife. Through the beveled glass, Claire could see Robert Chen's silhouette, flanked by 2 other figures. The moment of choice had arrived. They're here for you, Claire said, her voice gentle despite everything. The FBI has been building their case for months. Marcus Reynolds gave them everything. Michael's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. In that moment, he looked old, tired, and utterly alone. The children will know the truth. All of it. Because that's what families do, they face reality together, no matter how painful. As Robert's key turned in the lock, the key Claire had given him hours earlier, she saw something shift in Michael's eyes. Understanding, perhaps. Or acceptance. Or maybe just the recognition that some lies, no matter how skillfully crafted, eventually crumble under the weight of truth. 3 weeks after Michael's arrest, Claire found herself in her father's study, surrounded by the remnants of her old life. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaded glass windows, casting patterns on the oriental carpet where she and Emily now sat cross-legged, sorting through decades of financial documents. "Look at this," Emily said softly, holding up a yellowed envelope. Grandfather's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just weeks before his death, addressed to Claire but never delivered. As she read her father's words, tears began to fall, dotting the paper. "My dearest Claire. If you're reading this, I fear my suspicions about Michael were correct. I've arranged for a separate trust, one he can never access. Robert Chen knows the details. Remember what I always told you, our greatest inheritance isn't money, it's the strength to face truth with grace. All my love. Dad." Claire pressed the letter to her chest, feeling the echo of her father's protection across the years. "He knew," she whispered. "He tried to protect us, even then." James appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened after another day of trying to salvage what remained of the family business. At 28, he'd stepped into a role he never wanted, facing board members and investors with a quiet dignity that made Claire's heart ache with pride. "The foundation board meeting went well," he announced, settling beside them on the carpet. "Uncle Robert's legal team has traced most of the missing funds. We can restore the children's hospital project by spring." Claire reached for her son's hand, noting the shadows under his eyes, the new lines of worry on his young face. "You don't have to carry all of this, James. We can hire someone else to." "I need to do this, Mom," he interrupted gently. "For all of us. For everything the Sullivan name used to mean. Will mean again." Emily leaned against her brother's shoulder, their bond strengthened by shared pain and purpose. "I had lunch with Jennifer Hayes today," she said quietly. Claire looked up sharply, but Emily continued, "She's agreed to testify. Not for immunity, she's accepting responsibility for her part. But she wanted us to know something. About the night before Dad's arrest." The room grew still, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams as Emily shared Jennifer's revelation. "She said he spent that night writing letters. To each of us. The FBI has them in evidence, but she remembered what he wrote to you, Mom. He said, 'In trying to escape my past, I corrupted my future. The truth is, you made me want to be the man you thought I was.'" Claire closed her eyes, feeling the weight of those words. The man she'd loved had been a carefully crafted illusion, but perhaps somewhere, beneath layers of deception, he'd caught a glimpse of something real. The tragedy was that he'd chosen to corrupt it rather than embrace it. "I've been seeing Dr. Marshall," James admitted suddenly. "The therapist Uncle Robert recommended. She's helping me understand that what Dad did, it wasn't about us. His inability to love honestly, to live truthfully, those wounds were there long before we were. The hardest part," Emily added, her voice catching, "is remembering the good moments. The bedtime stories, the family vacations, the proud smile at my graduation. Were any of them real?" Claire gathered her children close, their heads resting against her shoulders like they had when they were small. "Your feelings were real," she said firmly. "Your love, your trust, those were genuine. We can't let him take that from us too." They sat together as the sun began to set, shadows lengthening across the study floor. Claire thought about the morning's therapy session, where she'd finally voiced her deepest fear, that she'd failed her children by not seeing the truth sooner. "You showed us what real strength looks like," Emily said, as if reading her thoughts. "Not the kind that never falls, but the kind that gets back up. That faces truth head-on." James nodded. "And you taught us that family isn't about perfect appearances or social standing. It's about standing together, even when everything else falls apart. Through the window, Claire could see the garden she'd been slowly reclaiming. The roses her mother had loved were blooming again, their beauty unmarred by the fact that the man who'd shared her bed for 25 years had never bothered to learn their names. "I've been thinking about the foundation," she said slowly. "About expanding its mission. There are so many others out there, victims of financial abuse, emotional manipulation. People who need to know they're not alone." Her children tightened their embrace, understanding the healing that came from transforming pain into purpose. In the growing darkness, they began to plan, their voices weaving together with a new kind of strength, one built not on deception, but on the unshakable foundation of shared truth and unconditional love. Outside, a car backfired, making them all jump. Then Emily started laughing, and James joined in, and finally Claire too, not because anything was funny, but because they were together, they were whole, and they were free to feel everything, the pain, the joy, the fear, and the infinite possibility of tomorrow. 1 year later, Claire stood at the podium of the newly renovated Sullivan Foundation Center for Survivor Advocacy, her voice steady as she addressed the gathered crowd. The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the faces of those who had come to witness this moment of transformation. "Healing isn't a destination," she began, her fingers touching the silver locket that still held her parents' photograph. "It's a journey that begins with a single truth, spoken aloud in the darkness. For me, that truth came wrapped in decades of deception, but it brought with it an unexpected gift, the chance to rebuild not just what was lost, but something entirely new." In the front row, Emily and James sat with Robert Chin, their presence a testament to the unbreakable bonds that had not just survived their father's betrayal but grown stronger through it. Behind them were faces that had become familiar over the past year, survivors of financial abuse, families rebuilding their lives, advocates and counselors who had helped light the way forward. "The Foundation's new mission grew from our own healing," Claire continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "When we share our stories, we transform our pain into purpose. We create safe harbors for others still caught in the storm." She thought of the letter that had arrived from Michael's federal prison cell last week, unopened, like all the others before it. They sat in a box in her study, a reminder that healing sometimes meant choosing which doors to leave closed. The children had their own letters, their own choices to make about forgiveness and boundaries. She had given them that freedom, just as she had finally given it to herself. James stood now, joining his mother at the podium. At 29, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came not from privilege but from hard-won wisdom. "Our father taught us about legacy," he addressed the crowd, but not in the way he intended. "The true Sullivan legacy isn't in trust funds or social standing. It's in the courage to face truth, the strength to protect others, and the wisdom to know that our worth was never tied to his deception." Emily followed, her professional camera hanging around her neck. She had spent the past year documenting stories of survival, creating an archive of healing that would be housed in the center's library. "When people ask how we survived," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I tell them about the morning after Dad's arrest. Mom gathered us in the kitchen, made toast with honey like she did when we were small, and said, 'We get to write the rest of our story.'" The audience murmured in recognition, so many of them had found their own ways to reclaim simple rituals, to transform spaces once shadowed by pain into sanctuaries of healing. Claire watched her children with pride that went bone deep. They had chosen to stay in the house where they had grown up, gradually reclaiming each room. Emily's photography studio now occupied what had been Michael's study. James had converted the formal dining room, where so many deceptive deals had been negotiated, into a community meeting space for survivor support groups. Jennifer Hayes sat near the back of the room, her presence a complex reminder of how healing rarely followed clean lines. After her testimony had helped secure Michael's conviction, she had devoted herself to helping other women recognize the signs of financial manipulation. Her own journey of accountability and redemption had become part of the center's educational program. Today, as we officially open the center's doors, Claire concluded, we're not just creating a space for healing. We're declaring that survival isn't something that happens to us, it's something we actively choose, day by day, truth by truth, step by step. The applause that followed felt like a release, a collective exhale from a room full of people who understood that strength often came disguised as vulnerability, that healing wasn't about forgetting but about learning to carry your story with grace. Later, as the sun set over the garden where 3 generations of Sullivan women had tended roses, Claire sat with her children on the back porch. Emily showed them the photographs she had taken during the ceremony, images that captured not just faces but moments of connection, understanding, and hope. "I saw Marcus Reynolds in the audience," James mentioned quietly. "He stayed for the whole ceremony." Claire nodded. The man who had helped expose Michael's true identity had become an unexpected ally in their mission to protect others from similar predators. His expertise in tracking financial fraud now served the Foundation's preventive education programs. "Mom," Emily said, reaching for her hand, "do you ever regret not reading Dad's letters?" Claire looked at her daughter, seeing in her face the same strength that had helped them all survive. "I read the most important letter," she replied. "The one Dad wrote to me before he died. The one that taught me to trust my instincts, to protect what matters most." She squeezed Emily's hand. "Some chapters of our story need to stay closed so others can open." As darkness fell, they lit the lanterns that now lined the garden paths, Emily's idea, a way to reclaim the night. Inside, they could hear the quiet activity of the center's evening support group, voices murmuring in shared understanding. "You know what Dr. Marshall said in our last family session?" James mused, watching the fireflies dance among the roses. "She said trauma doesn't just break us, it can crack us open to let in more light." Claire wrapped her arms around her children, feeling the solid reality of their presence. They had learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past but about choosing how to carry it forward. Their story hadn't ended with Michael's betrayal, it had begun with their collective choice to face the truth, to protect each other, and to transform their pain into a beacon for others still finding their way home. In the gentle evening air, surrounded by the garden's healing presence and the warmth of unconditional love, they sat together, not as victims of someone else's deception, but as authors of their own continuing story. The future stretched before them, not unmarked by pain but unmarred by fear, rich with the promise of dawns yet to come.